Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin, and today we're going to be talking about the government's view of development and how they're going to get to this 1.5 million building of new homes in the country. And joining me to talk about this is somebody who's well acquainted with the development market, David Galman, who is a property consultant and previously a director of Galliard Homes. Welcome, David.
Morning.
David, I'm going to start off with a rather sort of I think, shock announcement from Keir Starmer a week or so ago when he said that, if developers bought land, got planning and didn't build on it, they could find their land taken away and given to local authorities. Well, I'm just not quite sure how you'd approach that legally. It's a bit of a difficult one. So what I want to do with you, I want to sort of test your development experience and sort of say, well, perhaps first, could we discuss the different ways in which a developer will buy land, because that's the start. It's not just as simple as buying a bit of land, putting it on the shelf and waiting for the right day to build.
Far from it, I think.
There's all sorts of different ways of buying, isn't there?
I think we've discussed previously, and it's quite important to note that there's all sorts of ways to own land. It might be that the landowner themselves, they're not in a position to do anything development-wise, but they don't want to necessarily sell it to a developer. They want to enter into a joint arrangement with the developer to themselves become a partner in a development. You've got an option situation whereby someone will purchase an option to then go and try and get planning permission, because we know, and we've discussed it lots and lots of times, that's one of the toughest things in the world, is actually getting the planning permission in the first place.
We'll look at that separately in a moment, yeah.
So it's not just a case of you owning a piece of land, getting a planning permission, and you can start the next day. That's the problem. You simply can't, because there are so many pre-start conditions. Recently exacerbated by building safety regulator, something that's very important, that's absolutely key. But to get through what's called Gateway 1 and Gateway 2, I don't know if you've even read how difficult that is. Supposed to take something like 12 to 14 weeks. Anecdotally, at the moment, that's taking 12 to 14 months.
Right. I mean, I think there's two things. I think the general public, and maybe even the government, when they're sort of looking at these things, it's all right saying, well, if you bought the land, you got planning, you got to build it. There are so many sensitivities with that, aren't there? As you quite rightly say. I mean, I can think from a development point of view, I think what you'd start doing if the government are going to be so anti land banking product, all you're going to do is not buy, but you'll just give out a number of options and pay for a number of options. So you don't own it, you can apply for your planning, and who have they got to confiscate it from? They can't confiscate it from the owner because he's not parted with the property. The option remains with the developer, as and when he chooses to pull that option up.
And as and when he chooses is often, it can be determined by the market. One would be accused of, well, they're just going to wait for the market to get to a position where they can make the most profit. The reality at the moment is they're just going to wait for the market to get to a position where they can make any profit.
Yeah.
Because it is incredibly expensive at the moment to construct. Build costs went through the roof. And haven't come down, and they won't come down. They might stagnate where they are, but unfortunately the market at the end is also stagnating. So if you've got a stagnant market and high build costs, why are you going to go and build something if you're actually going to make a loss on that site? You just wouldn't do it.
Well, I mean, timing is everything. We've got developers around here. I mean, a number of the developments around here that were sold 10, 12 years ago, when the sort of Canary Wharf boom was really happening, we've probably dropped 25-30% over this last 10 years. Now, if you get caught in a drop in the middle of building perhaps a £500 million or £1 billion block, it'll be catastrophic. So timing is everything. And I think the other factor is people don't quite understand that, they think that applying for planning permission is a little bit like doing it for your garage or your home extension or whatever else. And it's a sort of set £250 fee or whatever it is. But I mean, literally, planning can cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, can it not?
Well, into the millions in some cases, depending on the size of the scheme and the scope of the scheme. The whole thing is incredibly costly. In our days, starting out, however many years ago that was, and we won't say that on here.
About 100, I think.
You'd get an A4 envelope, stick your plans in it, and you'd check for, I don't know, £250, and you might get a planning permission come out 4 to 6 weeks later after a simple committee hearing, and away you went. Nowadays, you have a pre-application and you have a pre-application, and so on, and all of that is incredibly costly. Yes. And time-consuming.
But I think the other thing to remember is that has got to run side by side what you're building now. Now, just because you've bought the land, which why wouldn't you? Because it's as a developer, that's your stock in trade, isn't it? Why wouldn't you buy the land when you see the opportunity? You can't just say, "Oh, righto, we'll start work." You try and explain that to your bank when you're asking for double funding of £2 billion to do 2 blocks. I mean, it's just impossible, isn't it?
I think there's a perception that the developers, small, medium or large, they're utilising their own money. They've got that much money that they can utilise their own money to A, buy the site, and B, develop the site. Where's that money coming from? It's just so you have to borrow it from the banks. The banks won't let you start on site necessarily until you've got 25 or 30% of the properties sold from plan. So it's a real difficult chicken and egg situation.
Yes, it is. And I think also, I know you were previously a director of Galliard Homes. Now, I think from memory, Galliard Homes are probably one of the biggest private developers in London. But they're nevertheless very hands-on and very sort of prolific in this particular area. Yeah. And you had a lot of success here. But it's a different game from being a national house builder where you're perhaps developing a 200 or 300 home site in the country. It's a different proposition, isn't it? Sales rates are different, focuses are different on design and presentation to the market.
If you have a large development site where you're putting, as you say, call it 200 houses of different degrees and varying different sizes, you're in a position where you can phase it, you can build 10, you'd actually say build 10, sell 10, build 10, sell 10, and your cash flow works that way. If you're putting a tower block up, it doesn't work like that because you have to get the whole building constructed.
Once you started.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't stop, and so you have to have the funding in place to build the whole thing, irrelevant as to what you've sold.
Yeah. Now, the other thing, David, is that the government are talking very glibly about this 1.5 million number to build within this parliament, which is probably, 4 years to go?
Yeah.
Do you think that's feasible? Do you think we have the workforce to do it? Do you think we have the material availability to do it?
I don't think it was ever feasible. I think it was brave or foolhardy to have a target. There's no harm in having a target. There's no harm in being ambitious. But I think it's crazily ambitious, and they've nailed to the mast to say we're going to build 1.5 million within this parliament, and they're not, because there's not enough private developers. A lot of private developers are struggling with labour force. We know that materials are a problem. We know that build costs are a problem. We know that banking finance is a problem. We know that planning is a problem. Wow, I sound like I'm a problem maker, but that's the reality of it. There are so many obstacles in the way that I don't think it was ever feasible. And perhaps they should have worked closer, hand in hand with the developers to find out what was feasible.
Well, I think it's a typical government sort of modus operandi. They've probably gone to the top 4 house builders in the country and say, well, what about this? But the difference is, I was trying to earlier just draw a distinction between sort of Galliard Homes type of people, which is successful private development, and the big, public companies. And the funding arrangements for those two entities are totally different. A big public company can raise its own finance.
Correct.
The bankers won't question their requests for support to that funding, whereas for the smaller SME, then it's a bigger problem.
Well, they'd have to raise banking finance in a world where money is no longer cheap. It's not as expensive as perhaps it was in our day when we remember mortgage rates going to 15% and so on, but it isn't as cheap as it was for 10 years. We had money being able to be borrowed at almost nothing for 10 years. And that's when you saw a boom that was created. That's now not the case. The banks are very very tough with their milestones that they'll put on a developer, that they have to achieve X amount of sales per quarter, or they've got to put more equity in, and so on. So everything is difficult, and there's a huge difference between the major house builder that's got public money and public funds. But even they will have bank borrowings, and they'll have bank finance, and they'll also have milestones that they've got to meet.
Right. I suppose that's the other thing when we talk about milestones. When we're talking about 1.5 million homes, what sort of homes are we talking about? I mean, there's so many different sectors. You've got your housing associations, you've got your local authorities, you've got pure social housing, you've got private housing, you've got, multi-unit housing. But each one of those sectors has got to have the money and the potential end user who's in a sort of, I suppose, cash rich in some cases for the deposits, but capable of buying those properties. Now, take probably the biggest one, which I imagine that the Labour government are thinking of, which are the housing associations and social housing, providing good service for those that need homes. But the problem is those housing associations have got to find the money. Now, we were talking off camera earlier that a lot of the problems in letting at the moment, in substandard letting, I think if you did a survey, you'd find that it was the housing associations that are falling short on these standards. Why? Because they haven't got the money to run what they've got. So how they're going to get funding for new properties, this 1.5 million that's going to be built, I don't know where it's coming from. Every one of those sectors has got to be capable of buying what's been built, and that's where I see it partially falling down.
I think you're right. The problem is a lot of these housing associations have got legacy issues with their stock anyway, that they're having to bring up to standard to meet.
That they were forced to take over.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. And unfortunately, social landlords appear to be the ones that actually have the worst case scenario in terms of maintenance of their properties. I'm not sure why that is, other than finance and resource. I'm sure that's part of the problem. So the government decides to beat up all landlords by becoming really, really tough on landlords because of that, which I don't think is fair. Resource is the biggest problem that all of these people have got, resource and finance. I'm sure the government would love to see social housing being built by housing associations and local authorities. As you say, who's going to fund it and who's going to build it?
Yes. I mean, again, these different sectors, they've all got their own issues. We've had people aghast at some of the news that's come out recently. We've had cases of a child dying in a dampened, almost derelict property. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. And I would, rather than chasing pie in the sky numbers of what to build, I'd sooner the government had put some effort into just upgrading the standards of what we have. Because the natural follow on from this, if we're not careful, we'll find that local authorities are asking developers to build something that is probably not as good as it should be. We could easily fall back into the 1960s of building what was called then concrete jungles. I'm not sure whether that expression still exists, does it? I don't know. But some of these nightmare estates that were built in the 60s have caused nothing but trouble, and are actually the subject of some of the stock that housing associations have actually taken over.
That's very much part of the issue. It's we do need a huge council house building regime and programme. We know that. It's not difficult to understand that. But for too many years, successive governments, you can lay the blame at everyone's door. So there's no party political side of it. Successive governments have forced the hand of private developers to provide social housing. And private developers don't really want to do it, but they have to do it to get their planning permissions. And then they just hand it over to a housing association to handle, who aren't the best landlords in the world, which causes problems. You're right, what the government should do is be providing enough resource and finance to let these housing associations and local authorities refurbish what they've got as a starter. How many must be lying empty that are in poor condition that actually, if they did the work on those, could be handed over to local authorities to house those that they need to house.
Yes. Coming back to the number that's going to be, or hopefully built, I do wonder about the supply of not only labour to build these homes, of which we're short of with the new, and going to be even more short of with the new visa regulations and entry to the country from overseas workers, but also the material supply. We've got the Ukraine, which is going to need to be virtually rebuilt in some cities. You've got Gaza, which is just decimated, which is going to have to be rebuilt. And all of these places that need this redevelopment are going to be sucking in the materials from all over the world. I mean, it won't be in inconsequential numbers or quantities.
Well, they'll suck in materials and they'll suck in labour.
Yeah.
You know, smart labour will think, I can earn
big money
fairly quickly, working overseas.
Our big contractors won't be slow to be
definitely not
pitching in to get the jobs.
No. So, which will again harm everything over here that we are trying to do. I don't envy the government. I think it's very difficult for them, and I'm not sure how they go about it.
I'm not sure that there was a sort of old ethos at one time. You know, if you work for a big company and you want to buy a computer system, then always go to IBM, because you know you can't be criticised, because biggest computer company in the world, whatever, it works, so famous, you can't be criticised. And I think the government are a little bit guilty of that with going to big developers, big house builders, and getting their information from that. We need to be on the ground with this stuff. And I think the only way of being on the ground is to be localised. I think the local authorities are probably the only ones that can really judge what's needed in any one particular area. They'll know their own sites that cause problems or that are not in the condition they should be. But again, I can't work out the government's idea here. They've almost demonised the small landlord, the small buy-to-let landlord, by tax hikes, regulations, and all the rest of it. But those smaller landlords provided thousands upon thousands of homes for the rental market.
Yep.
And also, because they are small landlords and they have a vested interest in their investment, and probably in a very concentrated way, because it's important to them in relation to their overall finance, they're some of the best landlords that we have.
I obviously know hundreds of small landlords because of the amount of properties we sold over the years, which went to what at the time we would term the housewife investor, was a single investor that maybe had one or two properties. And they actually bought with their heart as well as their head.
Yes.
And they actually looked after the properties.
And they wanted to own that particular property.
Correct.
Because it was nice, it was good, it was quality.
And therefore they would look after them so much better than social landlords and local authorities do. Much of that is down to the fact that they don't have the resource to do it. Whereas if you own one flat as a buy-to-let, you're going to make sure that that's well looked after, because that's your lifetime savings potentially in that property.
Absolutely.
But they've been beaten up over the last 10 years, and even more so now. Yeah. Even more so.
And what's the answer to that, David?
Well, the answer as far as the government's concerned is let's go down the PRS model, let's go down the American and European model, and have these giant companies that own huge swathes of properties that they let out privately on the private rental market. Well, they're in it for profit. They're going to let them for as high a number as they possibly can. And it's taken the private landlord out of the market. I know so many that are leaving. They've just decided it's just not worth the hassle anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And also, a lot have come out of the market in providing these smaller number of rental homes, simply because the government has had so many changes of course in terms of what they're suggesting will be the new regulations. I mean, we had that under Sunak where we were going to have this compulsory insulation of homes. And a lot of landlords, perhaps with Victorian properties or older properties, although were very nice and were good rental homes, would never meet the new criteria for insulation figures. So they sold their portfolios.
Yep.
And then, of course, the government just said, oh, actually, we've changed our mind. We're not going to bring that in.
Well, they're flip-flopping again, aren't they? Because they're saying that the EPC rating, you're going to have to get to a minimum of C. I bet you my house doesn't reach a C because it's a 130-year-old house.
Right.
So what are you supposed to do with that if you can't?
Time to move.
I come back to my roots. I come back to the East End. I don't. I think they just want to interfere in everything, unfortunately, and they think they're doing good. Where actually, just let the status quo be for a bit.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what's going to happen with all this potential redevelopment in around the world, sucking up materials, as we've said, labour difficulties? What really is the solution to quicker and more efficient development? Now, you and I have both gone through a marketing phase of where, you know, if you built a block of flats, if you didn't have a cinema, a gymnasium, Olympic-sized swimming pool, you might as well forget it. You know, you'd never sell anything. But those properties have now turned into being inordinately difficult to support in terms of service charge. It's all coming home to roost now. Will we see a change in architecture and a change in the type of property that we build? It's all very well having all these fancy facilities, isn't it? But they've got to be paid for, and they've also got to be restored at some point in time and refurbished.
Yeah, I tend to agree that I think what would be really good to see, and I don't see how you can do this in London, and perhaps London literally stands alone as you describe it, as it's a capital city, it's expensive to live here, and that's the way it should be. And you have conurbations around it that where you actually build houses. I think you need a lot more houses to be built rather than condominium blocks and so on, because as you say, they become very expensive to run. Everything's becoming more expensive. So whereas your service charge might have started out at a level that was very reasonable, all of a sudden it isn't. And it's to maintain all these extra facilities that I'm not sure they're really needed. They're great from a sales point of view. You're going to be able to sell something if you've got the facilities so much easier than if you haven't. But I think there'll be a simplification of developments forthcoming, because it's just too expensive to do, too expensive to maintain and run. I'd like to see lots of starter homes built just outside of London, just outside of those areas. But again, the planning authorities have to allow you to do it and have to give you the impetus to get it done.
Yes. Now, again, it's always a difficult subject. You know, in any city, there's going to be those that have and those that haven't, and all sorts of things have been tried in the past to provide social housing. And I suppose the last biggest liability for a developer was that he was going to have to provide probably 30% of the number of the development in social housing, along with getting his planning for the main private block. Are developers the right people to be providing this?
I don't think so, for more than one reason. I think it's unfair to put the onus on the developer. Okay, make a charge. The problem was that's what they used to do when we both first started out. You could buy your way out of the social housing contract by giving the money to the local authority for them to go and build it themselves, but they were incapable of building it. And there are many cases of that money being clawed back because it hadn't been utilised within a certain period of time. I think it's unfair to that, however, to ask the developer to provide a certain part of his scheme as social housing. And it doesn't work, does it? I don't think it works. You've got to be very careful how you say that, but I don't think it works to have it in that way.
I think to give a socially acceptable sort of example, if you like, you will see, you can walk around here, there are a number of blocks that are social housing blocks and there are a number of blocks that are private. Now, the private blocks will have what I would call a stronger management structure.
Yes.
And what you won't see is washing on balconies and that sort of thing. Why? Basically because it's a fire hazard. Yeah. You get fire hop from balcony to balcony if you've got washing out. You've only got to have somebody throw a cigarette end out of the top floor, and it doesn't go to the floor. It goes to probably 2 floors down on their balcony, you know, so quite dangerous. Now, so that's what you'll see in the private block. If you look across the road to the social block, you'll see washing out everywhere. Why is that? Probably because it was built to a much cheaper spec, no washing machines, no dryers, whatever else. So people hang their washing out on the balcony. And actually, apart from it looking a bit unsightly, the main problem is that it's a fire hazard.
Yep.
So you've got this disparity of standards within two buildings, and
I think you're right in saying that that's down to management, though. It's down to the fact that
it is,
the private block is going to cost you more to maintain, and the
Yeah.
private residents will pay that maintenance fee. We have, historically, sold a block to a housing association at basically cost or even a slight loss as part of your overall development, but you have to have a low service charge. So you won't have concierge, you won't have security, you won't have people looking after the block and the people. So it's going to run differently, isn't it?
Of course it is. But I tend to go with you in I'd sooner see a simplification of design rather than it just be an add-on to a block, or the first 6 floors of a block are social and the next 30 are private. I just don't think that works.
It's just not a very good social experiment, is it? First of all, you're making people feel excluded anyway, which I don't think is right socially. And it just doesn't look right, does it? The first 6 floors, as you say, the first 6 floors are entered by a different door with different management structure, and a different specification throughout the development, and the rest of the building is super luxury.
Yeah. And again, it's fit for purpose, isn't it? A condominium block, say 2-bedroom apartments, it's fine for a young couple, or probably without children, better without children, really, because of the stairs, the lifts, and all that sort of thing. Space, outdoors,
noise within the flats as well.
Yeah.
Children are going to be, with parents, children are going to be noisy. Is what you expect, but.
Do you think we have got space in London in particular, or in any of the big cities, major cities, to build more houses? Have we got the room to do it?
I think it needs looking at to see if there is, because there must be. There must be on the outskirts of cities. There's what you could perhaps call grey belt land, as they're calling it, which is not very good green belt, or not good quality green belt. Why not try and build some houses on that type of land?
Yeah. Is it hard to find?
Well, everything's hard to find, but I think you need to have a sustained effort of people getting out there and looking for it, identifying it, and hopefully getting on board with the local authorities early enough and quick enough to go and get your planning permission.
But don't you think, to a degree, it's either the government or the local authorities' job to perhaps identify these parcels of land and say, look, this is what we'd like on this particular plot of land?
Of course it is, and that's what urban planning's all about. But
it doesn't work that way.
Well, it doesn't work that way, because they're going to be re-elected in 2 years' time, the local people, and the MPs are 4 to 5 years. So if they're not sure if they're going to be working, why should they bother?
Yeah,
that's the problem.
I think I think what we have to do to get a higher number of homes, and I think you're right, they should be houses rather than blocks of flats where possible. I do think the local authorities or the government have a greater responsibility to identify these areas and make it easier for a developer to say, okay, well, I'll come in, I'd love to build that sort of 50 houses there. That's just in my sort of category, my financial wherewithal to do. And I think that in itself would speed up. It would also speed up planning, because if the local authority knows what it wants there, it could do various schemes with architects to allow them to put in tentative schemes, and a builder could just pick them up.
Or become a partner with the local authority.
Yeah.
I think that that has to be one of the ways forward. Small developers need to become in partnership with local authorities or housing associations to get these properties built quicker. And as you say, they will get a planning permission quicker. They might be if you're building a street of houses or a crescent of houses, whatever it is, you haven't got to go through some of the hoops that if you're building something that's over 18 meters, you can forget starting within a year of getting planning permission, and that's a huge problem.
David, I think just before we wrap the show up, I'd just like to ask you something about the Freehold Reform Act, or whatever they termed it as now. We're going to get a situation where I thought that the regulations may be retrospective, difficulty though that would cause. But in particular with ground rents, you're going to end up with a 2-tier property market here, aren't you? Those that have been developed post April, I think it was last
Yes.
year, not allowed to charge ground rent, and those that are already there charging huge amounts of ground rent. So it's going to make that development significantly more saleable than this one. Now, the government say none of it's going to be retrospective, but they are having a look at it.
I'm not sure how they can make it retrospective and be fair. It's going to cost a lot of money to
Well,
do
a
that.
lot of people have paid 10 times the ground rent
Yes,
to buy the
come out.
freehold.
Yeah. And I think you'll see that continuing. I think that's what's going to happen is that individual leaseholders will purchase their way out of their ground rent, and I think that's what's going to happen along the way, which would be interesting because there's a lot of companies that literally specialize in owning ground rents. That's what they do. They
Well, that's right.
Thousands and thousands of them. So their business model is going to change, one would assume.
Yeah. David, we've got so much more to talk about, but we've only got half an hour, so I'm afraid that'll have to wrap us up for today. But I shall be asking you back very shortly to carry on the conversation, I think. So there we are. Thank you for watching. I'm Stephen Galpin. This is Property Matters. Join me again next time.